Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, you're most welcome. This is a new video for you and the topic is volatility of commodity prices. This is part of theme 4, more specifically factors influencing growth and development, which is 4.3.2. The primary sector of the economy includes any industry involved in the extraction and production of raw materials such as farming, forestry, fishing and mining. What does the word volatile mean? My dictionary tells me that something is volatile if it's liable to change rapidly and or unpredictably. That sounds like my wife, only kidding. Getting back on point, the term volatile primary prices implies that the price of most primary products change rapidly over time and are unpredictable. Just look at what's happened to the price of a barrel of crude oil over the last 25 years. So let's look at this chart. So you can see here that back in the year 2000, the price of a barrel of crude oil was about $20. There was then a prolonged bull market. That means the price of oil rose up to a peak round about 2008, 2009, just before the crash actually. So it went up as far as $140 per barrel before there was a very sharp correction in the matter of months all the way down to $40 a barrel. From that point on, there was a recovery to around $100 a barrel in 2015. A very sharp fall again, and then another fall round about the time that I'm making this video in April 2020. And the fall in the price of oil back down to $20 is down to the fact that people aren't driving their cars due to COVID and the lockdowns. So there are two questions to answer. The first is, why are primary prices particularly volatile? We need to address that. And then secondly, are primary prices problematic for primary product dependent countries? You know, why is it such a big deal? Market price is stable when a market is in equilibrium. This happens at the price and quantity where supply equals demand. In this market, price isn't volatile. It will remain steady at P1. However, if either the supply or the demand curve shifts its position, the equilibrium market price will change. If demand increases and shifts to the right from D1 to D2, market price will rise from P1 to P2. On the other hand, if the supply curve shifts to the right, that's called an increase in supply, as you'll remember, that will cause a fall in market price. So what I'm trying to say here is that markets come into equilibrium where supply equals demand. Prices are stable when they're in equilibrium. However, if either the demand or the supply curve shift, there'll be a change in the equilibrium market price. And in markets where there's extreme price volatility, it therefore implies that from time to time there's regular shifts in supply and demand, which are in turn causing regular shifts in the price level. The supply of primary products can vary for all sorts of different reasons. In the case of oil, it could be that a hurricane disrupts oil production in the Gulf of Mexico, or in the case with a soft commodity such as cotton or coffee, it could be something climatic like a late frost that destroys the crop, and it could be that causes the supply shift that causes the price change. The demand for primary products is most often influenced by incomes. So during a boom, the demand for commodities normally goes up, and that will shift the demand curve to the right and cause the price of commodities to go up. Whereas in a recession, the demand for basic raw materials falls, and that will cause the demand for primary products to decrease, which will cause the price of primary products to fall. But as the slide says, it's worse than that, because primary products have both a price inelastic demand and a price inelastic supply. And we're going to look at that next. The supply of primary products is price inelastic. Why is this? Agricultural commodities take time to grow. Once the seeds have been planted, farmers won't be able to change supply in response to a price change until a new growing season begins. Look at what happens when the price of wheat increases from P1 to P2. Despite this significant price increase, supply only extends from Q1 to Q2. This is what price inelastic supply looks like. The supply curve has a relatively steep gradient. The supply of various minerals is also price inelastic. Take oil. It takes time to find. Once it's found, it will take several years more to build an oil well to get the oil out of the ground. During this period of time, supply will again be highly price inelastic. Let's talk oil again. Let's imagine that the market for oil was in equilibrium at P1Q1, where S1 equaled D1. In spring 2020, the lockdowns caused by COVID-19 decreased the demand for oil from D1 to D2. Due to the low PES for oil, the decrease in demand caused an exaggerated fall in the price of oil from P1 to P2. If the supply of oil was more price elastic, which is shown by the blue supply curve S2, the same decrease in demand would have caused a much smaller fall in price of just P1 to P3. The conclusion that we can draw from this analysis is that the low PES for primary products means that even small shifts in demand can create exaggerated price changes. But again, that's not the whole story. It is worse than that. Let's see. The demand for primary products is price inelastic. This is because there are relatively few substitutes for primary products. Take Cadbury. They buy cocoa beans as a raw material to produce chocolate. To make chocolate, Cadbury must buy cocoa beans. If the price of cocoa beans increases, Cadbury's will have little alternative but to pay up. Demand might contract slightly, but only because high cocoa prices will encourage Cadbury to adopt more efficient production processes that reduce wastage of cocoa beans. In this case, due to the low PED for cocoa, a significant price increase of P1 to P2 only results in a minor contraction of demand of Q1 to Q2. So let's see this change happen now. So you can see the price went up from P1 to P2, but it only created a very small contraction of demand from Q1 to Q2. So the demand for cocoa beans is price inelastic. Demand isn't particularly responsive to price changes. Low PED in primary markets means that even small shifts in supply can cause dramatic price changes. So let's have a look. The market for cocoa beans is in equilibrium at a price of P1 where S1 equals D1. Due to a late frost, the supply of cocoa beans now decreases from S1 to S2. You can see that change now. S2 is the red curve and it's shifted to the left away from S1. The low PED for cocoa beans means that the decrease in supply creates an exaggerated price increase of P1 to P2. By way of a contrast, look what a decrease in supply of the same magnitude would do in another market where demand is more price sensitive. So D2 is the more price sensitive demand curve. This time, with a less price inelastic demand curve, you can see that the same decrease in supply of S1 to S2 creates a far smaller increase in price of just P1 to P3. Why is primary price volatility a problem? Volatile primary prices equals volatile export earnings. Brazil is primary product dependent. A high percentage of Brazil's export income comes from exporting coffee beans. The total revenue generated by Brazil from this activity is determined by two factors. The first of these factors being the world price of coffee, P, and the second being the quantity of coffee sold, Q. As you know, total revenue is equal to price times quantity. The demand for coffee is price inelastic. This means that when the world price of coffee goes up, Brazil's export income will rise too. This is because the contraction in demand will be proportionately smaller than the price increase that created it. Look at the figures here. Again, total revenue is equal price multiplied by quantity. If we assume that the price of beans starts off at $2,000 per tonne and Brazil's exports by volume is 10 million tonnes, Brazil's total revenue would be 20,000 million or 20 billion. Let's imagine now that the price of coffee beans goes up by 20% from $2,000 to $2,400. I'm also going to assume that the price elasticity of demand is minus 0.5. So a 20% increase in price only causes a 10% fall in quantity demanded. That's why quantity has dropped from 10 million to 9 million, because I'm assuming price elasticity of demand of minus 0.5. What you can see here is total revenue going up from 20,000 million to 21,600 million. And the reason for this is just down to price inelastic demand. The percentage increase in price is greater than the percentage fall in quantity demanded. So mathematically, total revenue will always go up in that situation. Volatile primary prices create a situation of feast or famine for primary product dependent countries. Things tend to be very good for these countries when the price of their commodity is high. Let's dig into this. The export incomes of primary product dependent countries go up when the world price of their commodity rises. Ceteris paribus, higher export incomes will push the current account balance of primary product dependent countries towards surplus. In turn, this will increase the X minus M component of aggregate demand. Other things being equal, the level of AD will increase from AD1 to AD2. Assuming that spare capacity exists, the increase in AD will cause short-run economic growth of MY1 to MY2. So let's look at this now. You can see that aggregate demand is stable at AD1. The economy is in equilibrium. Now let's imagine that the price of this country's commodity goes up. As a result, its export income goes up. As a result of that, its exports, net export income goes up, AD goes up, and aggregate demand shifts to the right. Following on from that, there's an increase in GDP from MY1 to MY2. To produce this extra output, firms will need additional factors of production, including labour. Therefore, an increase in the world price of coffee will indirectly lead to higher levels of employment in Brazil. Higher levels of employment will mean that the government doesn't have to spend as much on welfare, and they'll also be able to collect more in tax. There'll be more people working, firms will be making more profit, so they'll be collecting more corporation tax, and households will be spending some of their additional incomes, creating extra indirect tax income. So this is all good for the Brazilian government's finances. The government is more likely to run a fiscal surplus as a consequence of the growth that was a consequence in turn of an increase in the price of coffee. But things aren't always good for primary product dependent countries. Things can get very tricky for them when the price of their primary product falls. Most primary product dependent countries are price takers. This means that the world price of their primary product is an external factor that is beyond their control. When the world price of coffee falls, Brazil struggles. The same is the case for Nigeria when the world price of oil falls. Low PED in both cases means that lower prices will reduce export income. Ceteris paribus, falling export incomes will push the current account towards deficit, which will decrease the net exports component of AD. Falling aggregate demand caused by falling primary prices has the potential to cause recessions in primary product dependent countries. The drop in national output created by a recession will decrease the demand for labour in the primary product dependent country in question, leading to higher levels of unemployment. The government's income tax revenue will fall if there are now fewer people in work. This will push the government's fiscal balance towards deficit. So let's take a topical example of a logic chain. So you've had COVID-19 lockdowns. As a result, people aren't driving. So that has decreased the demand for petrol. Petrol and diesel are cracked from crude oil. So that decrease in demand has caused a dramatic collapse in the price of crude. And it's an exaggerated effect because the PES for crude is very, very low. The fall in the price of crude has then caused nightmarish problems for Nigeria, who are primary product dependent in oil. And the same would also go for the Russian economy too. So what should primary product dependent countries do? Well, the standard answer is that they should try to diversify their economies away from primary products. So you could go down the route of a country like Germany, who produces highly differentiated, high value added manufactured goods. Germany isn't a price taker. Germany is a price maker. German exports are not susceptible to volatile prices because German companies like Mercedes-Benz and BMW, as I say, sell highly differentiated products. They set the price. They're in control of that. So that's one route out. The other route is, again, this is quite topical and trendy, is for a developing country to skip the manufacturing phase of economic development and go straight into tourism. This might be particularly suitable for developing countries who have a comparative advantage in tourism because of their climate. Again, you could try to create some differentiation in your tourism industry by cultivating a brand image that tries to communicate the message that a holiday in Jamaica isn't just any old holiday. It's something that's special and unique. And if you can do that and create a differentiated service, again, you become a price maker rather than a price taker. And this concludes the presentation on volatile primary prices.